each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreaming. We are the breath of the ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are mothers of mercy, fathers of time, daughters of dust, and sons of great vision. We're sisters of mercy, brothers of love, lovers of life, the wisdom of ages. We are a grandmother's prayers. We are a grandfather's dreaming. We are the breath of the ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are one. Good morning. I'm going to share with you a Bible verse that feels very much like it's a part of what we're talking about today when we talk about privilege.
Beautiful song.
Thank you. It's Ephesians 2, 8 through 9, and it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." So, it's my privilege to be here with you today. Privilege. A source of pleasure that was granted to me because Lester Sue reached out and said, "You want to come and talk?" She granted me this privilege to be here. Now, I've had an interesting relationship with the word privilege. Up until about maybe 5-7 years ago, I always attributed to it the meaning that I just gave it. A pleasure, an opportunity granted to me. And it always felt like, a good word. But in recent years, I've heard that word used a lot to address issues of bias, prejudice, power, and oppression. And most often, I've heard it tied to the word white. White privilege. The advantages that come with white skin, and by association, the patriarchal and racist system in which we move. And that privilege didn't have anything to do with me. Or so I thought. And it was my daughter who was the catalyst for me beginning to think about privilege in a different way. And you see, my daughter, if you were to meet my daughter, y'all would be blown away, because my daughter is the bomb. She is brilliant. And she is beautiful. And she is passionate. And she is a compassionate and ardent activist for social justice. And she has no patience for passivity in the face of injustice. She will call BS in a minute. And sometimes when she's home and we're talking, I suggest, well, I understand, and we're talking about this, but we might not be able to dismantle patriarchy before dinner's over. But, we're on the path. Just breathe for a minute, and then we can move. But several years ago, she called me one day because she was very upset. She had been in a conversation with an online community and with others who were ardently and equally passionate about activism. And she made a comment about relationships, and one member of the online community shut her down with the statement that she, with her 2 parents, needed to check her privilege before commenting. And she was wounded. She said, "I'm a queer woman of color in the Deep South. What are you talking about? I deal daily with oppression, and yet, that shutdown felt like an accusation, like an exclusion. You're not one of us. You have no say. Check your privilege and shut up." The word privilege as an accusation. The word privilege as a weapon. And over the past few years, that's how a lot of us have come to hear it. And it may be how some of us have used it. And generally, when we hear it, we feel some kind, or use it, we feel some kind of way about it. Guilt, anger, defensiveness, shame. I know that when my daughter called me that day, what I felt was defensive. Your father and I will not apologize for loving you and providing for you. We did not do this at anyone else's expense, I said. Now that's not the first time my children have addressed their privilege, though that was not the word we used when they were younger. You see, my children have 2 college-educated parents. And for as long as they remember, we've owned our own home. And those homes changed. So by the time our children were 3 and 6 years old, the home was 4,000 square feet on the Intercoastal Waterway with big old windows that faced the rising sun. They began their education in a Montessori school before they went to public school. They had extended, caring family all around them, many of whom were educators. The 2 parents had 2 cars. They were never hungry. There were always clean clothes. The house was filled with books and art. But they had friends who didn't have that. And as they got older, particularly my son, he started to be uncomfortable with the differences. I mean, at one point he came to us and said, "Why can't we just move to the projects?" And I said, "Your daddy and I worked real hard not to live in the projects. You don't know where we come from. This was a goal to not be in the projects." But he didn't get it because, you see, when the other kids came to our house, it just looked so different than their house. And it wasn't just the other kids, it was the other kids' parents who would make remarks about, "Well, y'all got all that. But just go ask your mom and daddy, they got it." And they began to feel some kind of way. Guilt and shame. And I remember at one point saying something that people with privilege often say. "Look, we did not hit anybody over the head to get this house. We worked for it. There's no reason to be guilty or ashamed because we have this house." But that did not alleviate my son's discomfort. Even though from the time he could move and go out to the community, he brought everybody he knew back to the house. And there were many times I walked into the kitchen and thought, "Who is this kid eating my groceries? I don't even know this kid." But it didn't matter. My son shared our groceries with the neighborhood. I think we probably served more fried barbecue chicken wings and French fries. We could have been a restaurant. The art supplies that my children used were also the art supplies that everybody in the neighborhood used. After a while, the family room, we just sort of gave up on the carpet, and that was cool. That was all right. Who do you think you are? Someone might intake, an accusation of privilege and a response of guilt. But following the conversation with my daughter that day, I began to explore that word for its layers of meaning. I began to think about and talk about the feelings that arise when the word is used. What does it mean to have privilege? And what is the appropriate response to having it? Now, this is the place where we look it up. Privilege, a right, an immunity, a benefit, enjoyed only by a person beyond the advantages of most people. A special right, immunity, or exemption granted to persons in authority. A grant to an individual, corporation, of a special right or immunity under certain conditions. And an advantage or source of pleasure granted to a person, as I used the day. A privilege is the right or advantage gained by birth, social position, effort, or concession. An exclusive right claimed and granted, often related to social status, heritage, sex, Now, as I looked at this, the thing that jumps out over and over again is granted. Granted. Privilege is not something we earn. In this case, it's not something generally that we work for. It was something that was granted to us. Yeah, our children had privilege because they didn't earn any of it. They didn't buy the house. They didn't educate the parents. They didn't make sure that they had transportation. They did absolutely nothing to have these advantages. It was just granted to them. Their house was filled with books and art. Just granted to them. So when you talk about this, then, where does it come in where privilege and oppression meet? Where is that? I looked at something that Unitarian Universalists handed out on privilege and oppression. It says, for persons with privilege, it is generally invisible. Not aware we have it. It gives advantages that are unearned, unmerited. And because the individuals who have it are unconscious of it, the advantages it gives may indeed be a direct result of the oppression of others. Not always, but it may be. And oppression exists when one social group, knowingly or unknowingly or unconsciously, exploits another for its own benefit, resulting in a condition of privilege for the dominant group and the belief that that dominant group's values and experience is the norm. Now, there are all kinds of privilege that exist. Some are often invisible. I mean, for example, something you don't think about. How many of you, this is what I remember as a kid, you get that box of Crayola crayons. Now, normally my mom and dad only buy the 24 count, but sometimes those 16 count and the 24 count, you can get the big box. I wanted that 64 count so bad. And when I was growing up, there was a crayon, it was called Flesh Tone. A lot of people pulled that crayon out and said, yep, that's right. But some folks didn't. The privilege of assuming that, well, this is what flesh tone looks like. The ability to receive information in a way that you always understand. Because it's in your language, or because you can see to read, or because you can hear. Don't think about it. Isn't that how everybody gets information? The ability to pay for increased convenience. I had a friend who used to say, well, you know, whatever problem is, if you throw $50 at it, it can go away. Unless you don't have $50 to throw at it. And for her, who was making, six figures at the time, that was something, he said, well, just throw $50 at it. That privilege that she said without even really thinking about it. There was an essay about privilege that came out in 1988. And based on that, a lot of folk have been working with this idea. What is privilege? How do we know when we have privilege? How do we know when we don't have privilege? And the very interesting thing to think about this is that just because one has privilege in one area does not mean one's not oppressed in another. It's not a blanket thing that if you have privilege, then you also are not facing oppression. As my queer woman of color daughter, with her college degree and her college-educated parents, who has a privilege, but also faces oppression. There's a game that sometimes is played. I don't call it a game, it's an exercise. And you may have seen them online where everybody stands up and are asked to respond. Now, I'm not going to have everybody stand up. But what I want you to do as we go through some of that, I want you to respond in here. I'm not going to ask you necessarily to raise your hand. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because when I watch these exercises, something very interesting happens. Eventually, there are some people all the way up at the front. And there's some people all the way back at the back. And when I look at the faces of those in the back, the burden of their awareness of their oppression is painful to see on their faces. And when the first time I saw this, I thought, wow, okay, so, I get to step forward on this one. And I'm leaving somebody behind me. But I can't step forward as far as that one. But to acknowledge the fact that I got to step forward here. And he or she didn't. So we're going to just do this quietly in our heads. right now. So, you can answer this inside of yourself. If your ancestors were forced to come to the USA not by choice, mentally, take a step back. If your primary ethnic identity is American, mentally, take a step forward. If you were ever called names because of your race, your class, your ethnicity, your gender, or your sexual orientation, take a step back. If there were people who worked for your family as servants, gardeners, nannies, etc., take a step forward. If you were ever ashamed or embarrassed of your clothes, house, car, etc., take a step back. If one or both of your parents were white-collar professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc., take a step forward. If you were raised in an area where there was prostitution, drug activity, etc., take one step back. If you ever tried to change your appearance, mannerisms, or behavior to avoid being judged or ridiculed, take a step back. If when you studied history or culture in elementary school, it was one of people like you, take a step forward. If you went to school and you spoke a language that wasn't English, take a step back. If there were more than 50 books in your house when you grew up, take a step forward. If you ever had to skip a meal or were hungry because there was not enough money to buy food when you were growing up, take a step back. If you were taken to art galleries or plays by your parents, take a step forward. If one of your parents was unemployed or laid off, not by choice, take a step back. If you have health insurance, take a big old step forward. If you attended private school or summer camp at any time in your life, take a step forward. If your family ever had to move because they could not afford the rent or the mortgage or foreclosure, take a step back. If you were told that you were beautiful and smart and capable by your parents, take a step forward. If you were ever discouraged from academics or jobs because of race, class, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, take a step back. If you were encouraged to attend college by your parents, take a step forward. If you have a disability, take a step backward. If you were raised in a single-parent household, take a step back. If you were raised by the foster care system, take another step back. If you saw members of your race, ethnic group, gender, or sexual orientation portrayed on TV as in degrading roles, take a step back. If you own a car, take a step forward. If you were ever offered a good job because of your association with a friend or family member, take a step forward. If you were ever denied employment because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, take one back. If you were ever accused of cheating or lying because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, take a step back. If you ever inherited money or property, take a step forward. If you had to rely primarily on public transportation, take a step back. If you were ever stopped or questioned by the police because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, take a step back. If every time you see a blue light, you feel afraid, take a step back. If you were ever afraid of violence because of your race, your ethnicity, your gender, or your sexual orientation, take a step back. If your parents owned their own business, take a step forward. If you were generally able to avoid dangerous places, take a step forward. If you were ever uncomfortable about a joke or statement related to your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, but you felt unsafe to confront the situation, take a step back. If you use a TDD phone system, take a step back. If you were ever the victim of violence related to your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, take a step back. Now imagine you're in a relationship, if you are. If you can get married legally in the state of South Carolina, take a step forward. If when you speak of your significant other, you have to be careful about what gender pronouns you might use, take a step back. If your parents did not grow up in the United States, take a step back. If your parents attended college, take a step forward. If your parents told you you could be anything you wanted to be, take a step forward. If you are able to take a step forward, take a step forward. If you open that box of Crayola crayons 20 years ago, and the flesh tone crayon looked like you, take a step forward. If you stood in the supermarket checkout line and you looked at the magazines, and just as it should be, they all look like you, take a step forward. So you've taken your imaginary steps. And I would imagine somewhere in you now you're having a reaction, a feeling of some sort about it, about where you might be on that line. You know, it may be guilt or shame. It could be anger or resentment. You know, our discomfort can be a clue. It can be a clue to our privilege or our oppression. It's a clue that we may have advantages that we have not acknowledged. Recognizing privilege doesn't mean suffering guilt or shame for your lot in life, because privilege is unearned, unmerited. What you have as privilege, you didn't choose. It was granted to you, to me. I had some wonderful privileges. My parents told me I could be anything I wanted, and I believed them. My daddy subscribed, never get that word right, to the books of knowledge. You guys know that kind of like this encyclopedia thing that would come to the house every couple of months? These brown books with stories and history, not history about me, but that was later that I recognized that, and fairy tales and all that stuff. And whenever that book came, I'd be like, yeah. And he also got the Reader's Digest condensed books. So those were books in my house, and the Bible, because, you know, you had to have the Word of God. Wonderful privilege. Now, my parents didn't go to college. My parents were not white-collar workers. My parents were sharecroppers, and my mother grew up in extreme poverty. But the privilege they granted me was a belief that education was important and was accessible to me. I had no doubt, though they could not send me to college, I had no doubt that I was going to go, because I had the privilege of their belief. I had the privilege of that church community. There's women in my community, you know, who, when you would learn to elocute in front of the church, because this is where I learned it, from my privilege. I can do this because of the privilege of my mama, who, when I would get an Easter piece, would work with me and say, now this is how you say that. That privilege. I didn't earn that. She just gave it to me. And then the church ladies would say, that was real good now, Natalie. You did that real nice. Now remember now, the word isn't get, it's get. I've never gotten that right, though. I had that privilege. I mean, and if you're at the front of the line, you know, nobody's saying that, well, you should be blamed for it. If you happen to have been granted the privilege, through no choice of your own, of being a straight, white, wealthy male, that does not make you an enemy. That does not make you necessarily dangerous. What makes us dangerous is when we have privilege and we don't recognize that we do. Because if we don't recognize our advantages, we begin to believe that the advantages that we have are our due. We have these advantages because we deserve to have them. Our advantages are a measure of our value. And by the same Word that.
Okay,
Thank you. Someone else's disadvantages are a measure of their value. We have it because we deserve it. They don't have it because they don't. If we don't recognize that we have it, we become the oppressor. Without even realizing that that's what we've done. And so I had to look at me and say, what are my advantages? I shared some of those with you. My daddy took us to the library. Each of us in first grade got a library card. Advantage. I went to private church school. Now, we didn't have any money. Daddy worked 3 jobs because he thought that we needed to be in church school. Advantage. Everybody in my house sang. I learned harmony by 6, which is why I could get up and sing. Not because I had some special dispensation. I had this wonderful advantage of a house full of harmony singers. Advantage, privilege. And as I looked at it, I realized the best possible response for me, for my privilege, after I recognized it, was gratitude. Wow. Wow. Look at this unearned advantage that has been granted to me. And when I can see, like in the case of my parents and my grandparents and those ladies in church, when I can see, you can't always see, where it comes from, but when I can see it, I can say, thank you for granting me this advantage. Now, my skin tone, I came from mom and daddy. We have this skin, we have this hair, we have this body. Nobody got up and earned whiteness or blackness or brownness. Nobody picked it up out the box. But we must recognize the role that it plays and how we are perceived in a world that values certain things above other things. It is disingenuous to say it doesn't matter. It is dishonest to say it doesn't matter. To look and say, wow, I've got this advantage. So we have our advantages. And as I began to embrace my advantage, first, with gratitude, I began to look at what else I can do once I have acknowledged the advantages, acknowledged my privilege. The other thing I can do is when somebody says, check my privilege, is to check it. That doesn't mean shut up and step away. I don't know what they might mean, but I know what it means to me. It means, is it possible that in this situation, I am looking at and making judgments based on my perception that my worldview is the right one? Let me check that.
Yeah, self-observation.
Yeah. Check your privilege. When someone said something, I remember someone saying to me once, poverty is a choice. Huh? At the time, we didn't use words like check your advantage, but what she said this based on her belief that her experience was a universal one. It's the baseline. That if you just get up and work really hard, you can accomplish anything. Which my parents told me, and I believed it. But some people start here to get there. Some people start here to get there. Some people are on the other side of this wall that seems so impenetrable. Getting there seems impossible. So check my privilege. To not take that as an insult, regardless, just to take the moment and see the experiences of others are not necessarily my experiences. And I have had a great deal of privilege. So that rolls over to the next thing we do is to acknowledge and respect the experiences of others and appreciate the effort it may take for them to overcome that gap. To simply appreciate that. You've watched, I was watching some sitcom, and it's something that you see a lot where, someone's, I'm going to run the marathon, and then somebody gets tired, they have lunch, they catch a cab, they get let out, half mile from the finish line, and they cross. Woo! That's kind of what privilege is. Because there's somebody who's running the whole 26.2 miles. And some of us, through no fault, because that's the word that we always respond to, it's not my fault, but simply have the advantage of a car having picked you up and taken you 15 of those miles. And you get out at 15 miles and you run hard. And you feel real good about it. You ran hard those 15 miles. But maybe at 26.2. To recognize that, to acknowledge that, to always say to yourself, their experience may not be my experience. My experience may not be their experience. I want to be open to that. And the other piece that I like to think of is what was said in 1 Peter 4:10. When you talk about, well, privilege. You know, when I was talking to my husband about this, and you know, when I'm going to do a talk like this, I talk to everybody, they're sick of me. And we were talking about the definitions of privilege: unmerited, unearned, advantage. My stepmother said, you know, unmerited favor. And my husband said, well, isn't that the definition of grace? Yeah, unmerited favor. And I looked at definitions of grace. The unmerited favor of God. Ain't nothing you do to get it. But there you are. There you are, based on someone else's largesse, sacrifice, suffering, what have you. So, 1 Peter 4:10 says, each of you should use whatever gifts you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. The grace in its various forms. The grace I have to have a house full of books. The grace I have to have transportation. We didn't get out and hitchhike here today because we have a car. The grace I have to, if you step in my house, I don't really like to cook that much, but if you got really hungry, I can pull something out of the fridge. And you can eat it. It might be scrambled eggs, but I scramble really good eggs. That grace. I am not hungry, obviously. The grace. You know, I have a friend, a young woman. I visited her recently in Brooklyn, and I used to call her my little sister. And she did this interesting thing when I visited her. She introduced me to her children who are now grown. She said, this is the one I told you about. This is the lady I told you about. When I was a little girl, she took me to the Alvin Ailey dances, and she took me to hear, I think it was George Benson. I didn't know folk could do stuff like that. Now, at the time, I was like 21. And I just wanted to take this little girl with me. And, you know, I was probably working in a supermarket. But I had that privilege of that job that I could buy that ticket. And I lived in my father's house, and so I was not homeless. And I had enough money to buy 2 tickets to the Alvin Ailey dances for the matinee. And 30 years later, she's talking about that. Whatever favor it may be, how do we use our privilege? How do we use our favor? How do we serve others with it? Because once we recognize our privilege, once we identify, once we express gratitude for that which we did not earn, once we respect and acknowledge the journey that others are on, we then need to use our privilege to serve others. It might not be a big privilege. When I'm in a supermarket and I can't reach the top shelf because I do not have the privilege of height, but that woman right there, who is 5'10", does, and she reaches up and she gets the thing off the top shelf, I really appreciate her privilege of height. And they're getting that for me. She didn't earn that height. She just had it. And yes, that's simple. But there are larger things, daily things that we can do. Before I close, I want to talk about one more thing that is on my mind, because as I said, when I watch these videos where people are moving forward and back. I look at the faces of those who are back here. And they see you, me, us, here, or here, or here. And when we are always in the back, we sometimes begin to believe that we are left out. We sometimes believe the bigger story ourselves. Oh. Whatever those things are. I don't have this advantage, and this advantage, and this advantage, and this advantage. Maybe I'll just sit down. And I thought, what do you do then? Because there have been times in my life when I didn't always look at the wonderful advantages that I had. The mama and daddy said, you can do with me anything. One of the biggest advantages I had. Didn't earn. One of the biggest advantages I had. The mama and daddy worked hard to make sure the Reader's Digest and the books of knowledge were in the house. Who took me to the library. There were times as I got older and moved through the world and encountered violence and bias and the line seemed so far ahead that you began to wonder if you should sit down or not. And I came across this really great article by Susanna Bartatotti, Liberating Ways to Overcome Internalized Oppression. When we start to believe it. When we start to believe that the privileged people have the privilege because they deserve it. And we don't have it because we must not. The first thing she says is to learn, begin to celebrate one's own unique self and culture. Instead of feeling ashamed of those differences, begin to share it, talk about it, embrace it. You know, to get to the point finally where I got to the point where I would say, ooh, I am short and round and brown and nappy, and these are just some of my assets. Boy. It doesn't matter if they didn't put me on the front of that magazine. I used to grow up with 17 magazine and Teen magazine and Glamour magazine. Ain't never seen nobody look like me in none of those magazines. But to say, this nappiness is like one of my really great assets. To the point that finally I'm at the place where I'm just like, oh girl, please, yes. I just love it so. Another thing, which sounds simple, begin to take up space. When we're somewhere, tell ourselves, I belong anywhere I put my feet. Plant your feet, claim it. Don't worry about that. Plant your feet, claim it, and when you take the next step, claim that. Simple one, sometimes my daughter and I talk about this a lot. Just breathe. You know, that Spirit of God, the breath of the ancestors, take it in. I like to remind myself that I am the future my ancestors dreamed of. I say, okay, it might seem like it's there, but my ancestors dreamed that I would even be here. Yeah. So, I'm going to dream for the next ones to be there. Breathe. Tell the truth and speak it loudly. I would say in love and kindness, but tell the truth. And then the last two, and they aren't the last two, but the ones I'm thinking, practice love and forgiveness. Now, it's funny with forgiveness. One of the people that I have to forgive regularly is me. I forgive myself when I have not acknowledged, I realize I have not acknowledged my privilege. I'm sorry. But I forgive myself. I forgot how my mama and my daddy told me I could be anything. Forgive others. That's sometimes hard. Forgive others for their blindness. They don't see it. They might not have acknowledged it. But I find carrying it around becomes such a load, such a burden, sometimes I can't move. My daughter, he says also, wish your oppressors joy and love. Now this can sometimes be hard. My daughter and I talked about this. I said, well, let's just think about wanting for them what you want for yourself. And so my daughter said, well, I want clear skin. So sometimes, whenever we're talking about, let's say, the current presidency, she said, may you have clear skin. So that's the only thing I can think right now. May we have clear skin. So, what are your privileges? What can you be grateful for? What can you acknowledge was granted to you as grace that you did not earn and did not deserve? How can you acknowledge the journeys of others? How do you check our privilege? When we get that discomfort, when we feel that resentment and defensiveness, it's a sign. Check our privilege. See if that's what's going on. I'm not saying it always is. And then, as Peter said, let's use our grace in whatever form to serve others.